Hi, everyone. Welcome to the symposium talk today. So my name is Oscar Serrano, and I am organizing the talks organized from the Center of Advanced Studies of Blanes. Symposium is a consortium of organizations, namely the IMEDEA from Mallorca, the CEAP from Blanes, the Institut de Ciències del Mar from Barcelona, and then the Institute of de Investigaciones Marinas y de Ciencias Marinas de Andalucía, that we're trying to bring excellent researchers worldwide to present their research and share the community, new advances, etc. So today we have the pleasure to have Kerry giving a talk, and it's my pleasure as well to introduce Rohan Arthur, that knows Kerry very well, and he will perform or introduce Kerry's talk today. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Oscar. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. It's an absolute pleasure and my privilege to introduce Dr. Kerry Sink. She's a marine biologist working in South Africa at the South African National Biodiversity Institute, which is an institute that is devoted to biodiversity mapping and taxonomy, and in converting all that information into action on the ground, as well as well-being. I'm sure Kerry might tell us a little bit more about the institute in which she works. So I first met Kerry, I think, in 2017, I think, Kerry, when she was being awarded the Pew Marine Fellowship, and we were in Chile at the time. And what she was proposing was bold and I think seemingly impossible for one person, even an entire team to do. And what she was planning to do for her Pew project was to increase the protection of South African waters from, I think it was less than 1% at that time, to 10% in the span of just a few years. And of course, I knew that with the Convention of Biodiversity requiring countries to meet these targets, I was familiar with the number of numerous paper parks being created around the world that made no sense on the ground. Coming from India, of course, I was very familiar with that. But Kerry was different. I mean, listening to her speak, and over several conversations since then, over the years, it is clear that the work that Kerry's team is doing is grounded in the best conservation science possible. It is careful, responsible, and highly considered, as I think that Kerry's talk will certainly make clear to everyone here. Kerry Sink, I think, is an absolute force of nature. She has carefully and tirelessly documented the diversity and function of coastal and deep waters in South Africa. She's absolutely dedicated to the deep waters of South Africa, and her passion will become obvious to you from her talk. Over the last 20 years, she has been exploring the deep water benthos of South Africa, mapping the highly productive great escarpment in the Atlantic, and documenting the diversity that gathers around seamounts and canyons below the photic zone. As you can imagine, with the number of mining and fishing interests in these waters, the work has not been without opposition. But Kerry has been able to work together with industry and with local communities to arrive at sustainable and reasonable solutions that last beyond the bold headlines. I think, for me, what is amazing about her efforts is that she, you don't see Kerry seeking the limelight, and she's working very quietly in the background without looking for recognition for it. She remains deeply implicated and embedded in the process. And I think that's extremely important. She's stuck with this issue for so many years, for decades. At the same time, I think she maintains the essential spirit of what I call the badass adventurer, and which is what's brought so many of us to marine science. It represents for me the best way of doing conservation science, with circumspection, responsibility, and humility. I think it's going to be a privilege to have her speak to us today. Over to you, Kerry.
Thank you, Rohan. I really appreciate that really warm welcome. And it's a real privilege today to share some of the stories from my last 15 years of work. So today I thought I would share with you some critical background to this, and you've already laid out some of the groundwork in terms of the challenges and the industrial interests in South Africa's oceans. But I'll give a bit more context to that. And then I thought it would be cool to share a series of insights that span from the technical work to design protected areas, which really is the easy part, but then into the implementation challenges And then a few things that I learned during this period that might be useful for other countries and for other efforts. So to start with that context, and you heard that when I began this work, South Africa had 0.4% of its ocean space protected around mainland South Africa. We also have some territory around the Prince Edward Islands, and there we have a very large protected area because it's a much less utilized seascape. But around mainland South Africa, we had at this stage 25 marine protected areas, constituting that 0.4% of ocean space over the more than 1 million square kilometers mainland area. And in 2019, we were able to proclaim 20 new protected areas. And this is covering 5.4 thousand hectares and moving us from that 0.4%, adding 5% protection. And this was the 5% that had really been worked on for a long time. And then the commitment to try to meet 10% protection is something that we're still busy with, but I'm really going to focus on how we moved from 0.4 to 5.4%. And this 5.4% is representative of most of our marine ecosystem types. You'll hear that a critical foundation for this work is a national map of marine ecosystem types. We have 150 marine ecosystem types in the country, and most of them now have some protection. And importantly, this step, this declaration in 2019 represents 97% of our marine protected area estate. So it's really a significant advancement in protection. And it caused me to reflect on an interesting paper that I read around hot moments for biodiversity conservation. And I think South Africa's story really shows us one of these hot moments. And there are many conservation scientists who deeply appreciate the need for spatial prioritization. But what South Africa's story tells us is that there are also key moments in time. And we need to pay more attention to learning about when to support conservation efforts and when to move forward and when to slow down. And I think we learned a lot in our process around the timing for protection. So some key background: South Africa is very much a maritime nation. We've got territory in 3 oceans: the Atlantic with a western on our western margin, the Indian Ocean on the eastern margin, and then the Southern Ocean. We've got 22 offshore commercial fisheries sector. We've got emerging small-scale fisheries and even neglected subsistence fishes, so complex fisheries communities. We are a country that was really built on a mining economy. The economic center of the country is in Johannesburg, in the center of the country, away from the coast, which is quite unusual. But it's because of that strength of the mining economy that underpins the development of South Africa. And the mining industry was one of the biggest challenges in getting this work right in implementing protected areas. We have 21 petroleum rights holders, and then diamond, phosphate, and other mineral mining activities in South Africa. And the reason that mining is so difficult is that prospecting, seismic exploration, and any type of mining is prohibited through South Africa's Protected Area Act. The first effort to try and establish what I refer to as offshore protection, and when I designed the offshore protected area work, we started at the 30-meter depth contour to move away from that coastal complexity and focus more on the deeper water, but not the true deep sea as most deep sea scientists beyond 200 meters, but really just from the 30-meter contour out to the EEZ boundary. And in 2004, the scientists at the time, Professor Colin Atwood, he's now at University of Cape Town, tried to proclaim the Namaqualand Marine Protected Area on our west coast. And I learned a lot and really designed the process for our network of offshore areas by studying what went wrong here. And really, I call the 3 elements that stopped the establishment of this protected area the trifecta of offshore protection achievement, really. It's the 3 factors that really block the establishment of offshore MPAs. And the first one is really insufficient knowledge and capacity. And even when you have the knowledge and capacity, you've got to convince people that it's good enough, that we know enough. The second one is the accusation of insufficient consultation. And this is a complicated area. I'll talk quite a bit about it. And the third one is the economic impact. So for the first time, there was this proposed protected area that overlapped with our most important fishery sectors, with the oil and gas industry, and with the diamond mining industry. And certainly success was not achieved in 2004. It was the first time a marine protected area had been gazetted for public comment and then not moved forward at all until 2019. And so this particular protected area is one of the important ones in the story. When I began this work in 2006, 17% of South Africa's offshore ocean territory was under lease for petroleum exploration and production. So just 17%. When I had identified a potential network of marine protected areas in 2010, we were at about 60%. And by the time we could move this work towards implementation, 98% of the production, 98% of the ocean space was under lease with production rights. So this is a substantial challenge. At the same time, in 2014, on the 13th of January, a colleague of mine who had immigrated to Canada sent me this notice from the Canadian press, where I was amazed to learn that South Africa had issued a phosphate mining lease to a Canadian company that was 10 times the size of our largest protected area on land, the Kruger National Park, and so much bigger than our current total marine protected area network. And in stark contrast to the duration and consultation process that we have for establishing protected areas, this happened in 3 months with no consultation, despite the fact that it really overlapped the core area of our most important demersal fishery, the hake fishery. So that gives you a sense of the challenge. This is a summary really of the key components in the 14-year process that led to the establishment of the network. And there are two critical elements that I want to point out. The first one is the value of the systematic conservation planning that underpinned the design of this network. But the other one, and even more importantly, is the stakeholder engagement, which runs throughout the process. It stops there abruptly because once this protected area was announced for public comment and the comment process was closed, we had a period to make balanced compromise and address all the public comments. So that's why it stops the multi-sectoral engagement at that point. But many one-on-one meetings had to happen during that time. So we knew from the literature that we had to engage stakeholders from the outset. It's very clear that this is the single biggest predictor of marine protected area success. And we knew that optimization algorithms, which are part of the methodology for systematic planning, could help us design a spatially efficient and representative network of protected areas that could meet both conservation and fisheries management goals. We had in mind really integrated achievement of an improvement ecosystem-based management of both fisheries and the marine environment. And after 4 years, we had a really well consulted systematic conservation plan and a set of focus areas for moving forward with protection. But then came what I experienced as the most chilling experience in our story. We had designed this network and worked with a single government department, the Department of Marine and Coastal Management, which dealt with both fisheries and marine biodiversity. And as we were ready to implement this network, the government fractured this department and sent fishery to forestry and agriculture, and then separated out ocean management away from fisheries. And that left our existing marine protected areas at that time and these new ones as kind of these children in a bitter divorce. And they were transferred for 4 years between these departments, and we didn't know what was going to happen. And in that time, there was really no opportunity to advance marine protected areas. But in 2014, our hot moment for protection came, and this is when I was able to secure funding for my Pew Fellowship to move this forward. And we did this through really focused research And Pew funded a communication campaign, which I'll talk a lot about, because without that communication campaign, we wouldn't have been able to achieve this. So I'm going to move on to some of the key insights. I've got 5 sets of insights from this process. And the first one is really the technical insights. So for those of you who are interested in systematic conservation planning, this uses an algorithm to help you identify those areas that will meet your conservation objectives, but you can minimize, in our case, we wanted to minimize the impact on the ocean economy. So it's how you can design a network that achieves the most, but with the least impact. So there's something you want to optimize and something you want to minimize. And the critical layers that we had in this was a national map of marine ecosystem types so that we could build a representative network, many species layers with a focus on threatened species and key foraging areas, many spatial layers to support fisheries management. So maps for vulnerable marine ecosystems, nursery areas, spawning areas, bycatch. So that was one of the things we wanted to reduce. How can we reduce bycatch? So understanding hotspots. And then we built what's called a cost layer. That's the economic cost of protection. So we use pressure maps or industry use maps to put that together. And we sought to do integrated planning, so both biodiversity and fisheries management, because then that's the optimal, it's less hungry in terms of space. And then we have aligned products that are supporting ecosystem management. And this was a key element. We had the team members were working across these different areas. One of the innovations in terms of planning was the multiple cost services. So we separated out benthic costs. So in other words, where we were going to exclude people from seabed activities, and pelagic costs. So that is where you're also potentially impacting pelagic fisheries. And we had both of those available. But most useful was the cumulative cost layer, because that's where you could determine where no-take zones are, because that's going to displace everyone. It was also useful to have industry-specific cost layers, but that was more for industry-specific interventions that we developed alongside the spatial planning for protected areas. So having these multiple cost services really allowed us to be more flexible and allowed us to support zonation, including vertical zonation, which was really key to some of the compromises, especially in really deep water. We couldn't motivate for a huge impact on a pelagic fishery when the true goal was actually protecting sensitive VMEs 3 kilometers below, recognizing there can be benthic pelagic coupling, and the ideal might be to have a no-take zone, but in reality, we were able to achieve protection for that seabed through this compromise. And then importantly, we were able to have different industry targets to make sure that we had what I call more equitable planning. And this is a hot topic at the moment. How do we do more fair conservation planning? And in my view, that's about spreading the impact so that everyone's only a little bit unhappy. We don't want anyone to be very unhappy. We want to spread the impact of conservation across the multiple stakeholders. And in the coastal context, especially, which is not where this work focuses, but just to say that's really important, because you might want to prioritize the most vulnerable coastal communities who might not be able to absorb conservation impact. And then importantly, in this project, we drove our optimization to align with the ocean economy goals. The second aspect of insights is really around the stakeholders. The most challenging part of this process to build deep stakeholder relationships. And I was saying we know that stakeholder engagement from the outset is the most important predictor of effectiveness of marine protected areas. So we knew to do that, but it's difficult and it takes a long time. It takes really a lot of creativity and a lot of understanding to develop those deep relationships with your stakeholders. And you need to understand and account for for stakeholder complexity. I like to borrow from Shrek here, because for me, stakeholders are like onions. They have many layers. And so within, you know, people working in protected areas often start off quite simplistically, just having stakeholders as a single group, but actually there are many, many sectors. And within those sectors, there's different components and different companies. And then if you're able to build relationships with the champions and influencers, then you're really able to have success. And like Shrek, for me, it's those champions and influencers who can become the real heroes in the story, people embedded in industry who care. And it's often hard for us to find those people, but when you can find those people, or when you can build that understanding, you really can move forward with effective negotiations. And one of my most important lessons in this work is just to keep getting ready, because when the moment comes, when the hot moment comes, if you don't have mature stakeholder relationships that you need for effective negotiation, you won't be able to take things forward. It really takes trust to achieve this sharing of fine-scale priorities, such as those that unlocked the conflict in the Namakwa protected area that I was telling you about. And you know, we had some difficult moments. We would produce these maps with fine-scale priorities, and one day, one of the leaders from the oil and gas industry came with his map. And he had a lovely term for this map, which was the heaven and earth map. And what he told me was that the green areas, he doesn't care. If we try and put protected areas in the green areas, so I'm looking at that little map on the right, but in the red areas, I should know that he would move heaven and earth to stop me. Anyway, it sounds intimidating, but it wasn't quite as bad as that. And actually, it was this brave man who was willing to share those fine-scale priorities and enter into 3 years of negotiations, who was able to establish our first marine protected area on the West Coast, because without that support, we wouldn't have been able to get it right. So importantly, and more, and particularly in the stakeholder, coastal stakeholder processes to resolve issues with South Africa's existing protected areas, I'm learning how important the stakeholder process is. And, you know, nothing prepares you for that as a natural scientist. And so we need those partnerships with social scientists, because your process is what influences participation and protection. South Africa really has a long way to go in terms of equitable planning, because we're still wrestling with historical injustices in our protected area network. And so we're having to work hard to improve the human dimensions in our planning processes. But if I analyze the stakeholder comments over time that have come in from running these processes, it's really clear that engagement, deep engagement that is tailored to stakeholder needs, and you need to do things like translate for local audience, is worth it, because it's those deep relationships that are then able to unlock the critical elements in the negotiation process. So one of the other things that I've learned is the value of broadening knowledge, really. I mean, I'm a natural scientist, but I've learned to broaden my understanding of knowledge to include traditional knowledge and multiple forms of knowledge in terms of moving this work forward. So this has been really important in recognizing the role and the deep connections that Indigenous people and local communities have to South Africa's oceans. The Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative has just produced an interesting policy brief on this that gives guidance on inclusion of traditional knowledge in deep sea management. And in South Africa, this has been really relevant, because the Nguni cultures have deep spiritual and cultural connections to the sea. And my colleagues in the One Ocean Hub are making a beautiful animation about this. It's going to be interesting to see where this goes. In many Zulu and Xhosa, for many Zulu and Xhosa people, there is a belief that the oldest and most powerful ancestors reside in the sea. And there's the story that we learned from doing this kind of work. We've been mapping culturally significant areas to feed into spatial planning and having these in-depth conversations that build on these relationships that we've been building. And the story that came out with some of my colleagues interviewing traditional medicine men and historians was that the belief is that when a human dies, the soul is literally distilled out of the body in the process when you're buried into the water system, and that the soul travels through the rivers and streams, through the estuary and into the deep sea. And then when the soul is mature, the most mature ancestors who are ready to be reborn travel up to the light and are taken up by the sun. And then that soul will fall again to ground in rain, and you will be drunk in by your new mother. And that's really a story of the water cycle. And in so many cultures, water is sacred. But recognizing this and these values has really been transformative. And so really, I'm thanking my colleagues for pulling me into transdisciplinary research, because it's broadening our knowledge base and changing our relationships. The third set of insights I wanted to share emerge from the research networks. And I've already reflected on the value of the social scientists in our research letters, in our research collaborations. But this quote here is from one of my colleagues who wrote a letter to the Minister of Environment in my defense. One of the fisheries scientists had written to the minister to say that I was not following good practice in marine protected area design. And this was something that myself and many other people working in ocean protection have experienced with local and international scientists really strongly against protection. And I think robust debate about this is really valuable and encouraged, but people working in this space also need support. And my experience suggests that a strong team of multidisciplinary scientists is critical to the success of these initiatives. We invested in data collation and targeted research to address key knowledge gaps. We had dedicated cruises. That was really a privilege that the South African government supported dedicated cruises, such as the Deep Secrets cruise, which allowed us to go and see areas that had been identified through spatial planning, but we had never seen. So that really helped us in refining protected area boundaries. So that was really responsive research, but also provided an important opportunity for capacity development. In South Africa's spatial mapping and planning work, we always strive to iteratively improve things, but we don't not move forward because we don't have enough information. We're just always working to improve things and simultaneously build that capacity into the future. And so I just wanted to mention South Africa's amazing young scientists and students who without whom wouldn't have been driving these iterative improvements in our knowledge base, in our mapping work, in technology. They're incredible at building new camera systems, in social media, in all of these aspects. And really, I'm grateful South Africa wouldn't have been able to expand its marine protected areas if it wasn't for these team of young people and also dedicated scientists, including scientists from more developed countries who were willing to come and work with us. Then Rohan mentioned the importance of industry cooperation in this work. I mean, this is critical for a developing country where you don't have the tools and capacity to do research in really deep water. And so for us, key enabling factors were cooperative research projects that were born from, we had an Offshore Environment Forum, a multi-sector forum designed as part of that stakeholder process. And in particular, seabed management conditions that were raised in eco-certification. This helped us to make a substantial contribution to the knowledge base by having those eco-certification conditions and then working with industry to achieve them and making sure that some of the protected areas would contribute to that eco-certification. We really took some important step forwards. And when it came to cabinet decision, we needed to demonstrate that. That was part of aligning with the ocean economy. And then similarly, data provided by the oil and gas industry really helped to give us our first data for seamounts and submarine canyons and finding seeps. So those industry collaborations have been critical. Then I wanted to touch on the issue of inequity, actually, in marine research and management, and the work that we did to really try and understand the barriers that limit exposure and participation in marine research and management. We've recently looked deeply into this with a focus on the deep sea, which is arguably one of the sectors that's most associated with colonial science. And this has been exciting for me because by understanding these barriers, we're able to make some suggestions and put some steps in place for how to address these challenges. And this has been guiding our capacity development efforts. And some of the key elements in this is the early exposure to the ocean and the deep sea, dedicated financial support, access to vessels and training, academic champions and mainstreaming have really been critical, and just more innovative research partnerships have played a particularly transformative role in this. You'll see, for those of you who know Lisa Levin in this picture, Lisa is a scientist who started, one of the scientists who started the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. And Lisa was willing to come and work with us in South Africa, and inspired a whole cohort of scientists and really taught them how to work within the constraints of the gear and the technology that we had available to really make the most of that. And that was very valuable. It's very different to the more common approach of sending one developing country scientist to participate in an international cruise. South Africa still needs to overcome many of the barriers that limit exposure and participation in marine research, but we're making progress in this context. My last set of insights are really the thing that I wish I knew at the outset of this journey. This is a lesson that I learned through failure. And I'm sure you can relate that the best lessons are probably taught through failure. In 2014, when our president at the time initiated an ocean economy lab to fast track the development of South Africa's ocean economy, I saw that as the moment to insert our systematic conservation plan and to implement these protected areas that we had designed. And I did that because it was a sustainable oceans economy. So there was an ocean governance component. There was a 6-week intense lab process. We were all there together, and I was part of this group. And it was during this high-level presidential initiative that I thought we were just so ready to take this forward that I realized really clearly that we weren't ready. You know, we had all the science and the data and all kinds of things, but I got this clarity on that pink post-it note, which says, this group has no relevance in the Ocean Economy Lab. And it was clear that we were completely failing in communicating the importance of this work to cabinet members, to government officials, all of whom believed that ocean protection was in complete conflict with the ocean economy. And that's where I had to design a dedicated communication campaign, and where my Pew Fellowship was really its most valuable. We developed a strategic communication campaign to better communicate the need, the purpose, and the benefits of protection in alignment with an ocean economy and to an audience that saw protection in conflict. And the way that we did this, we were very lucky to be able to draw from some research that had tested messaging frameworks. And it's a universal lesson about knowing your audience. And so as part of other work, my institute, the National Biodiversity Institute, had tested a whole bunch of messaging frameworks with government officials and decision makers. And this work was done and successfully increased the budget of our institute by more than 3 times. And we had tested a range, 8 different messaging concepts. But what we learned out of this and what was relevant to protected areas is that if we framed protected areas as national assets, if we linked protection to our children's legacy, and if we showed that protected areas are practical solutions to solve multiple problems using our optimization models, we were most likely to inspire action amongst our decision makers. And we call this the Making the Case project, where we really focused and invested on refining this messaging. So the protection messages emphasize the contribution that protected areas can make towards societal and development objectives. So for example, we had economic and other rational messages to explain why it's important, because protected areas can contribute to development goals, such as food security, job creation and security, climate resilience, and the blue economy. And then drawing from research that showed that many good environmental decisions were motivated by consideration for future generations, we really embedded this, this aspect of the future and of our children in our communication campaign. And then referring to protected areas as those practical solutions to achieve multiple objectives. And this is just some examples of the kind of messaging that were able to emphasize coexistence of protected areas and industry activities, the streamlining of environmental management, and the benefits of protection. So it was this reframing of ocean protection as a critical step. And the decision makers that we had been interviewing as part of the Making the Case project really advised that the continuous kind of negative doom and gloom message led to a sense of apathy. And so we really strove to inspire action. We moved away from the kind of fear of loss and centered on what do we stand to gain rather than lose. Our Minister of Environment at this time really encouraged us to take the communication work to the next level. This is a website that we established, and this was because she demanded a clickable map where she could click on any of the protected areas and see inside. And this really helped us to show the beauty and the fragility of some of our ecosystems that occur nowhere else on Earth. It helped us to show the richness and diversity of life in muddy sediments, which you wouldn't expect. And I sat with Minister in a meeting with ExxonMobil, and she actually used this slide and spoke about the creatures living in the muds where Exxon was wanting to drill, and it was part of the difficult negotiations for this boundary. This kind of communication and these images also help to show the value of strange creatures like this hemicordate, which has produced one of the most powerful compounds ever tested against cancer. But this bioeconomy link was critical to our success. And then the wonder of this 40-kilometer ridge, which is only 500 meters wide, but 40 kilometers long, where our kingclip, their cusk eels aggregate to spawn. They're drummers, they call to each other across the ocean and they aggregate to spawn. When I tell this story, this decision makers are just hooked in and become deeply interested and are inspired to make sure that this phenomenon continues for future generations. This particular image, which Lisa took under the microscope during the Deep Secrets cruise, has been one that has inspired interest. Here you see the eyes of future fish in the arms of a soft coral. And so it links back to the messaging on future generations. So we emphasized the contribution of protection and alignment with the ocean economy and took this forward in multiple formats, and eventually taking this into the South African cabinet. And these efforts played a disproportionate role in South Africa's protection journey. I was actually asked in an interview if I could pinpoint my favorite 5 minutes in this 15-year journey. And for me, it's really the moment right after this work was presented in the economic cluster of cabinet. So the economic cluster of cabinet is really the jugular of cabinet. There's obviously an economic focus, and I was really nervous. The first minister to respond was the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni. He put his light on and he leant forward, and I kind of held my breath. But what he said was, South Africa has to do this. This protected area network is an investment in our country's future. And for me, that showed that our communication campaign had worked. So in closing, three quick lessons to share. Firstly, looking after the ocean really needs effective communication. As a community, we need to have clear communication goals. They need to be tailored to a well-defined audience. And it's really valuable to bring in not just the economic value, but particularly the emotional value, the practical value, and to reflect on the importance of this for future generations. We really need to reveal marine ecosystems to extend the privilege that we have as marine scientists to many more people. And my mother uses this beautiful term. She calls it rolling back the blue blanket so that people can see below. And this has inspired an ocean literacy project in South Africa. It's called the Mzansi Project. That's the next name for South Africa. It's the Zulu word for in the South Africa, Mzansi. But we've got the sea at the end of that. And this work hopes to inspire a deeper understanding of marine ecosystems and to support more equitable learning. And finally, to recognize existing deep links and foster further connections with coastal and marine ecosystems. The second lesson is really that relationships are just as important as data. Sometimes when I'm feeling brave and I'm not talking to scientists, I say more important than data, but really they are equally important. And I think we really need to embrace that stakeholder complexity. We need to build the relationships that we need for the ocean we want. I've been talking about this in the efforts for the decade of ocean science, because we must remember that alongside the critical science is the need for a diverse, deep, equitable, and mutually beneficial set of stakeholder relationships. And to protect and care for the ocean more, I think we need a flexible and adaptive process. We need to be alert to opportunities. And I tell young scientists, don't wait till you're more certain, till you have more data. Just begin and strive for iterative improvement. Be alert to opportunities, align your plans and goals and messaging with global and government priorities, and be ready for when those hot moments strike. We all get despondent in work to make a difference, but really, if we keep getting ready, the time does come. South Africa has really shown that trifecta of insufficient knowledge, inadequate consultation, and economic impacts can be overcome, even in a developing country context. And I was interested in this work that Enrique Sala and his colleagues did using systematic conservation planning. They attribute the low levels of global ocean protection to the same challenges that I think South Africa has been showing progress. And they have been optimizing biodiversity protection, fishery sustainability, and climate resilience, something we didn't give enough attention to, but really positioning us for global progress. And I think we can all support these efforts by clearly communicating the value and benefits of healthy oceans and by diversifying our approaches to achieve this. And we can only do that by building the relationships that are necessary to strengthen the capacity, the science, the knowledge base, and the negotiations we need to better look after our common ocean heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kerry, for this inspirational talk. Thanks for sharing all your knowledge and experiences in setting up these marine protection areas, and also for your great achievements as well. Very well done. So if anyone in the floor would like to pose some questions to Kerry, please list them in the chat. And first person to do so is Ananda Pascual. Ananda, if you can set up your camera and open your microphone, and you can pose the question to Kerry yourself.
Hi, thank you very much, Kerry. This was really amazing, this talk, and I think we learned a lot. I wanted just to ask you if you could give some more examples, like specific examples on how you build the relationship with the stakeholders, and also about the communication campaign, so if you can give more details and what is the most efficient way of communication from your standpoint.
Okay, so I think importantly in the stakeholder relationships, you need to first of all spend time to understand who the stakeholders are. And then you need a process where you develop one-on-one relationships, but you also need to bring your stakeholders into the same room. So for us, a critical forum that we established was called the Offshore Environment Forum. So that is where all the different fishery sectors, the people who manage the submarine cables, the people who do law enforcement and fisheries enforcement, the mining industry, the oil and gas rights holders, all come together. And what's important there is that they realize that anyone doing planning has to account for the constraints of all these different stakeholders, and they also start building an understanding. So that's one example. And that's the importance of the multi-stakeholder engagement, which you need to have at moments throughout such a process as this. But then you also need to manage those one-on-one. So a very practical example I can share with you when trying to work with the petroleum industry is if you find the geologist who's also an earth scientist. This is from my perspective because I'm a natural scientist. But another scientist or a person that you can relate to, and then you take that time. I had to do some strange things, like the one champion oil and gas guy. He called me up one day and he said, "Oh, will you come and identify some shells? My son has a school project that he's doing on shell collections." I had to make that effort. And it was sometimes those personal things. The Biodiversity Institute manages a set of national botanic gardens. And one of the things I did was to have my meetings, the one-on-one meetings with stakeholders. So the heads of different fishing companies or oil and gas companies, I would ask them to come and meet with me in the botanic gardens. So we'll bring nature into the room. In fact, there's no room. We are walking in nature. And we would, and they really came to enjoy it because many of them are sit in a concrete office all day. Now we're in a different world where it's all virtual. But even now, the most recent meeting I've had, I asked them to come and sit with me under the tree, just 3 of them. And we were looking at ways to take this forward and looking ahead at the next 5% now. It's been really difficult under COVID with that stakeholder kind of engagement under these conditions. And then you asked about the communication. The short film that we made, I think, was, we have a short film, I'll happily send the link, was probably the most powerful communication campaign, tool that we had. But then the protected area with the map where you could click and look inside on the website, the clickable map in the website was also a key element. And then very targeted communication for the decision makers. So when I went into cabinet, I had a booklet designed for decision makers, and we had to show them, and they were very interested in this, the compromises that had been made and how we had actually balanced compromises against this network and were aligning with the economic imperatives. So that kind of booklet for your cabinet ministers is a very distinct thing from very general communication like a brochure or, so it's a set of tailored communications for different specific audiences.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Ananda and Kerry. So Teresa Alcoverro, feel free to make your question to Kerry.
Yeah, hi. No, first of all, thank you for this amazing talk. It was really, really nice. I was just wondering how we can actually introduce also climate change into all this scenario. If you have, I was just asking you how have been your experience, and if when you come into climate change and protection of the oceans within it, how has been your experience, and if it's too much of an abstract concept, and sometimes it's better to just go into marine protected areas specifically. Just wanted to know your experience.
Yeah, a couple of things. So first of all, for me, having a representative network is part of the climate resilience strategy. Then to acknowledge the difficulty of working with the climate scientists in the country who often could not agree on the direction of change, let alone the extent of climate change. So that was a big challenge for us in putting climate change spatial layers into our National Biodiversity Assessment, which is also a key input into our plans, but also into the spatial planning. It's getting a bit better, and we now have climate velocity work underway to look at degree of change, and we're taking a strategy where we want to protect resilient areas, but also areas of change, because we don't know which strategy is going to be more effective. We're also trying to improve connectivity data and bring in genetic data into this work for the next 5%.
Okay, thank you. I guess that we are all facing with the same problem, and yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Kerry, your next question is from Jordi Pagès from the CEAP in Blanes. It's actually two questions for you.
Yes, sorry. Thanks for the talk. It's been really interesting. I wanted to ask about if you used, for example, to translate the benefits that people perceive to gain from protection, if you use the concept of ecosystem services or nature contribution to people to translate all these benefits that might be a bit, again, difficult to convey to the stakeholders, if you use that. And then also the second part is, how do you convince people to invest in these little bit abstract or long-term goals when they are already struggling in their daily lives, maybe? So if they're struggling with their more important day-to-day needs.
Okay, so
equality.
Yeah. So first of all, I think in terms of benefits, we very much did work with the concept of ecosystem services. And for a while now, South Africa has been using a term that we call ecological infrastructure. And that's because our government really sees the value of infrastructure in a development context. And we've been making the arguments that if you look after your natural infrastructure, it's much more cost effective. And that has had a lot of traction. So you can read about, if you Google ecological infrastructure and SANBI, you can read about some of that work, but that's particularly powerful for decision makers, not so much for people on the ground. And then in terms of your question around people who are, struggling with the now, I don't try and convince such people about the value of protection. People who are struggling with the now need to be, those are the vulnerable people that you need to take into account in your spatial planning, and make sure that those people are not carrying the cost of protection as far as possible. I think that is something that needs more attention. But in my view, we should not be trying to convince those people who are trying to survive the now about the future. That task is for the more privileged, and the cost of that should be carried by the people who can bear that cost.
Thanks, Kerry and Jordi. People in the room, feel free to pose your questions. And Kerry, I have a question for you, actually. You mentioned that it's quite important to establish links with industry. And then my question relates in particular to the oil and gas companies, that typically they invest heaps of resources for mapping and scoping the projects, etc. But then tend to keep this information confidential. So is that your experience, that it's very, very hard to gain data for the deep sea from them, and therefore they're kind of blocking the designing of MPA?
That's exactly why I found myself doing school projects for oil executives' children to help get access to that data. And it shouldn't be that way. And we didn't leave it there. We've been working with the government department to work on the permit conditions to make that data become publicly available, but it's not going very well, to be honest. We're still struggling. And it's only by the only times I've succeeded to get that data back is through the deeper relationships with some companies, and usually only if there's nothing of value found in that area, then they're more comfortable to release that information. But we're still working hard in this area, and recently we've had many more inputs in terms of industry priorities at a fine scale that have helped with our spatial planning. But it's been difficult to get that valuable seabed mapping data from the oil and gas industry. And we created, we worked with the permit issue holders, and then we created also a forum to work with the oil and gas industry and try to show the benefits of these collaborations, but it's difficult.
And it's the same for the impact assessments, so all that information is more publicly available.
It's the same for the impact assessments. It's difficult, and we've been motivating the companies to use local experts, and there's a reluctance to do so. They usually work with international experts, and then it's difficult for us as scientists to make relationships. But in 2 of the deep sea leases, we were able to get, for example, the footage from the seabed surveys and get really some of the first biodiversity on the slope and into the abyss to get data from that. So that's been valuable, but it's not easy.
All right, so there are no further questions. I would like to thank you and give you a warm thank you actually for this amazing talk. And this is on behalf of all the symposium organizers, and especially for Rohan, who kindly invite you. And then I would take the opportunity to announce the next Sea Symposium talk. It will be about the seagrass microbiome by Professor Gerard Muizer from the University of Amsterdam, and will be organized by IMEDEA in Mallorca. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Kerry. Looking and wishing you all the best in your initiatives and success. And see you all next time. Thank you.